Alright, in this part we'll be doing the cabin for the bulldozer. And we're going to start off by taking our block out here, and I'm going to isolate this mesh and duplicate it to our high-poly layer, take it out of the block out layer. And then right off, I'm just going to start cleaning up some of this geometry. As you can see, I'm turning a few of these triangles back into quads. Now, you could think, why didn't we do this in the first place? Why did we create a block out with tris in there if we're going to use it afterwards? Well, that doesn't really matter that much, since the blockout main goal is just doing things fast, getting the shape down, and it really wouldn't matter that much in terms of time if we would have done it with all quads right away. So we're just going to go ahead and fix things here. It's not really hard. Removing a few edges and adding a few extra with connect and cut. Just making sure that this stays simple and that I get the shape down as basic as possible. Another thing I'm doing is I'm deleting that extruded box at the back. I've decided that I'm not going to use that sort of system. I'm going to change things around. It has to look a little bit different. I want to have a rear window that is extruded inwards instead of outwards from now on. So just moving these around a little bit, snapping things. I just want to make sure that all the edges on this mesh are nice and clean. As you can see, it only takes a few minutes, so really not worth it to spend more time on the block out to get a decent wire done there. Then I'm just moving these edges around to create the basic shape of the extruded window. And what we're mainly doing with this cabin out is taking the block out and adding a little bit more detail to it, just taking it a few steps further. Adding a few extra edges that are needed. And the reason I'm adding these edges might seem strange is, well, the whole sloped section underneath the window is really, really complex. It's really, you'll see, I'll just delete these right away and then start modeling that. First I got to move these around a little bit. I want to get the main shapes down first before I move on to the smaller details. That looks about okay. Right. So that done, I'm adding this edge, and this edge is enough for me to start adding the new geometry for the slope section at the back of the cabin. You see, this is a bit of a complex shape. There's a few different areas that are sloped at different angles, and they look a bit funky, so gotta change that around. I'm welding these parts together, and as you can see, I'm creating a few triangles here. Sure, yeah, they're triangles, you want to avoid that for high poly, but for now I'm just going to leave these because I think the basic shape can be done without triangles, so I'll go back to those and fix them later. Deleted the top since I want to do the window, the roof as a separate part anyway. And right now I'm just selecting separate parts and detaching them. I'm detaching this one since it's sort of storage box, or I think there's something electrical inside there. And it's on the outside of the cabin. It's an actual separate part in real life. So I'm just going to model that as a separate part. No reason keeping things attached if they're not attached in real life. You're just needlessly complicating things for yourself. And interestingly, this box has this slightly sloped shape to it. And I want to align these before I forget. So there we are. Move that one slightly down. You got lots of different angles playing here, which makes it an interesting shape to look at. Alright, so here there's this another part. This part is just another section of the cabin that sticks out. Don't ask me what it's for, but it looks interesting, so that's why I'm creating it. Right, so I'm moving these verts up a little bit to get everything aligned. You can see there's some sort of sloped surface here. And I want those to align with the back surface nicely. Then I set the smoothing groups right because it's just a lot easier to see what you're working with when you keep your smoothing groups updated. Then a small extrude here. And what's this for? Well, there's another box shape over here. And just simply creating that. Trying to get the basic shape right. You can see it's a lot more interesting than it was on my block out, but I didn't really see the point in modeling all of that with this amount of detail in the block out. Would have just taken a long time and not really necessary for that. So when you're working with these separate parts, very important is you got to remember to have everything fit together really flush, or you have to make sure that you model all the insides of parts so that you can't see through them. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm creating the inside so there are no gaping holes in my cabin, because that will really stick out. So I'm taking this part and I'm detaching it to an actual separate object. It's just a lot easier to work with. I can quickly hide and unhide parts that would be obscuring parts of my view. And I'm just doing a small inset there because there's a sort of open grille in there. I'll get to that later. First I want to do the basic shape. Also, there's this sort of lip on the outside there that folds over the side of that bulldozer. I'll get that in there too. And then just adding a few extra edges to get the flow down right. It was actually an end gone, so I fixed that by adding this extra cut. And with that done, I want to add some thickness to this lip that folds over. It's really important to give these parts some thickness because, well, if you don't give them thickness, it's going to come across as fake and it won't look as chunky and solid as you want this bulldozer to look. Right, so this part, I'm just going to remove it because I realized you take that sort of inset shape for a rounded object, and this actually is a square part, so it's better to use these loops that go all around the object. Just better to work with. There we are. And adding a few of those there to make sure those edges are smooth and right. Okay, that looks pretty good. Right, so next thing is there are a few nuts sitting on the outside of this object, and this is not the actual nut itself. Around the outside of the nut, there's this sort of rubber bushing that prevents the nut from getting hit, from preventing it from being unscrewed by itself by hitting debris or anything. And so I'm actually moving the nut on the inside here, scaling it up slightly, giving it a little bit of a random rotation, and then attaching things together and attaching them to the main object. I think that rubber bushing on the outside doesn't look chunky enough, so I'm just going to select it and apply push modifier to my selection. With that push modifier done, that looks about right. I'm going to collapse that, then go back in, select everything, and position it correct, and then just duplicate it 3 times. Don't have to use any spacing trace because there's only 3 and I can eyeball that. Right, so this box looks okay, so I'm changing the color. There's one thing left to do. I said there was this sort of air vent grille type of thing on the side, so I'm creating this plane that will serve as the louvers for the air vent, making sure to decrease the number of segments, and then just manually extruding the edge to get things as a solid part in there. Okay, so we're just duplicating these and deleting the one that you can't see, selecting all of them, moving them upwards, and then I change the scale a little bit. Got to make sure you're scaling them all towards the center of the group. And when they're in the correct position, I just select all of them, and I made sure to name them correctly before I did that. Okay, so one thing that's slightly bothering me on this part is the top of the box should actually be flat, and the slope is a little bit different, so I'm moving that a little bit, and then adding the edge back in there. So you can see me create a cylinder here, and this cylinder is for a small detail. It's actually an interesting detail. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but this entire bulldozer has an armor on the outside, the slat armor, and the slat armor is attached to these little cylinders with mounting holes. I decided not to model the slat armor, but I still want to make the little mounting cylinders because they just look interesting. They're interesting as a shape by itself, and they make for some cool details, so that's why I'm creating them. And also, they're really simple to make, as you can see. It took only less than a minute to create them and then just duplicate them around. Another advantage is I can use these shapes to create another detail, which is like this square with one of these cylinders on the corners. So I'm just moving that around. And then I'm adding a top part here. You see that I took a plane and then I duplicated that. And then I'm just adding a few segments to that. It's a quick way to add geometry. Just take a plane from an object you've got selected, shift move it, and you've got some new geometry. I added some segments to move these points around. Why am I moving these points? Well, it breaks up the, how'd you say that? that it's just too straight. It makes it look a little bit more alive and beaten up by adding a little bit of waviness to it. Then I'm just adding the edges to make sure things are smoothed correctly. And there we are. Now that part is about done. There are still some more details, but I think I've got to work on the general shape more before I just completely focus on that part too much. What I'm doing here is I'm selecting the separate armor plates of this bulldozer. Just selecting them and then detaching them to a separate object. Why am I detaching them to a separate object? Well, all these armor plates, they're all put together and they're just separate parts. And they actually have big fat seams between them. And I want to make sure that these seams are visible enough. And the reason for that is, well, it just looks more interesting. So that's why I'm detaching them. And when I detach them, I just perform a few extrudes on them, add some extra edges. If I would have kept these all as one object, then it would be a lot more difficult to give them this appearance of thickness and this patched together feel of the plated armor. So once again, just look at how things are built up in real life and try to mimic that in 3D. That's what I try to do a lot of the times. So extruding this part as well, adding the edges to it, real dead simple stuff. And I can't forget to close up this hole at the bottom. Do the same thing over there. And then move on to removing some of these edges here. As you can see, these are separate objects and they don't need to have edges that are continuous that run across all of them. So I can just remove some of these. I'm spacing them out slightly. Why? Well, to make sure that the smoothing works correctly. If you would keep it all as a single plane in the center there, you would get a few smoothing problems. So I'm just adding these edges and leaving them in there to make sure things are smoothed correctly. Now this door needs slight adjustment. I think it's not as wide as that. And here I'm adding some extra edges. Why is that? Well, the door is on this side. This armor plate is actually where the door for the driver is. The driver opens this, gets inside the cab like that. And I think that this door, because it's actually cut out of this armor plated section, I actually need to do the same thing. Cut it out, make sure there's a sort of section that's extruded inwards, and make sure there are some interesting edges there. You can see I performed an inset. Why? Well, the edges of this door are rounded, and I think if I use an inset, I can get that rounded shape to look better once the smoothing goes on. So look at that. That's my door shape. Forming an extra inset just to make sure that the edges are rounded nicely. And then I'm doing a extrude. And I've also detached that to a separate part. Why? Because the door is a separate part. And now I just attached the door to a cube that I created using the AutoGrid method. And that just simply resets the orientation of the door. Make sure that it's oriented in the way it's actually facing, instead of inheriting the pivot point of the object it was created from. So that just looks better. All right. Duplicating that back in. Just making sure the door has a front and a back side. Changing the color. I do this color changing once I think an object has progressed far enough. And it shows me also which objects still need work, like the cabin. Leaving that brown because I'm not done with it at all. So doing the same two extrudes on the panel for the door. And then performing another extrude on the door just to get the geometry down right in there. There we are. Now add the edges for the smoothing. Like so. I'm just moving these edges around a little bit to flatten them. And I've just hidden that box temporarily. And it makes it easier to work with these parts over here, just so that I can see a little bit more. Detaching them as well. I'm just going to do the same trick on them here to give them this armor plate look. A few extrudes. I'm doing two. Why? Well, to make sure that the smoothing is correct. Add some control edges. Same thing here. And that looks about okay. So back to this part, selecting it, and I'm going to detach it as well. to work with it separately. And I'm extruding this one because, well, it might work better if I create that box on the side as a separate part that extrudes out of it. Study the reference a little bit closer. It's a bit of a strange shape that seems to originate out of that sloped surface. So that's what I'm creating here. And you might say, oh, there's another triangle. Doesn't matter that much. We can fix it. And then do another extrude to get the final shape in there. Now this is what I was talking about. I'm extruding this one, deleting those edges, and then welding these back into that position. And now I still got to align the front vertices with the front surface so that I can get things to match up nicely. There we are. That's the shape I was talking about. But this shape is still a lot more complex, so I got quite a bit of fixing to do on there. It's almost the same as those strange sloped surfaces on the back. They got a bit of interesting geometry going on here. So we have some work to do. As you can see, if there are triangles, I just use a Swift loop against them and they instantly get turned into quads, and the the loops work again. This one on the side, there's no reason for that being a triangle, so I'm just going to fix that again. As you can see, I forgot a little bit about the edge running around, so I removed it, and I'm going to add it back after that. Showing the geometry again so that I can align things. And then adding the control edges. Right, so a few of these edges really sit too close together. I'm moving them, and a careful eye might see that there's another triangle there now, but it really doesn't matter. It's so tiny, it's not in a critical area. I'm just going to leave that. It really doesn't matter. It's not going to mess things up or anything. So I'm not liking this geometry, so I'm removing that. I'm just going to connect them up like that, creating another triangle, but if I remove that edge, it's done again. You can test that by just seeing if Swift Loop draws a nice blue line that loops around. And if it just stops strangely in a single surface, that means there's a triangle and that you might need to fix that. But as of now, we're just working with this, and we're going to see how it goes once we add the Turbo Smooth. I'm just trying to place edges in all the areas where I think it will be necessary. And where I think it will be necessary is just me looking at that and thinking, is this going to be a hard edge? Yes, then add one around it. It's going to be soft, or, well, most of them are hard here, so it's mainly just puzzling with all your separate edges, making sure that they all work together nicely. As you can see, there's a problem there. We forgot a little edge that we need to add. And we actually need to add another one here, and the geometry isn't working, so I'm just going to select everything and then use the Swift plane, the slice plane, I'm sorry. Slice plane is a really easy method. You just position a plane, hit slice, and the plane slices through all of the selected geometry. Easy, fast, I like it. Alright, there's still a bit of a smoothing problem at the back there. I get smoothed it a bit too much there. You can see it sort of fades out. All I gotta do is remove that simple polygon. And that looks okay. Well, there's a slight problem there. And I can see why that is. It's because there's a triangle there. At the bottom we also have a bit of an n-gon, so we can just use those to cancel each other out. Selecting those, using the cut tool, cutting that up there, like that, and like that, and there we are. That part is fixed up. Okay, so I'm adding a few more edges here to make sure that the smoothing on the back will work. And now I want to go ahead and add some thickness to this part. We can't just use the extrude method here. The geometry is too complex. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use an extrude on the edges instead of on the faces. And extrude on the edges actually extrudes in a way that is perpendicular to the surface. It's something that people rarely use, but I think it's really useful for this kind of stuff. Right, so that thickness looks about right. Looks right with Turbo Smooth also. And the thing is, now this box over here, it's actually separated from the part next to it. It's easier to model it into one piece. And then I'm just going to detach it and clean it up a little bit afterwards. Move that in slightly. details like this that'll make it more interesting. Differences in height and that sort of stuff. Move this one over there. Move it slightly further over there. Select the vertices, hit weld, and make sure that they are welded together. Okay. Just moving these points around a little bit. This is just cleaning up work after I split these two parts away from each other. I'll do the same thing here. And weld the verts once I create the extra geometry. There we are. And then these can all be removed because they're not really adding anything to this shape, so I'm not going to leave them in there. This one is necessary because it's actually connecting to an open edge. And at the back here, we're also aligning that. Now, with the front of this box thing, there's some sort of panel. I think it might be a storage box, and well, of course, you need a panel to access it. You can open that and see what's inside there. Not sure if it's storage, might be anything. Electrical systems behind it, whatever. This panel has rounded edges, so I'm creating some geometry to support that. Using scale tool to get things down uniformly. Then doing an inset so I can get a nice rounded feel in there. I hope by now you're getting the difference between using edges that are around an object and edges that are an inset of an object. It makes a big difference in how the final result is smoothed. Now what I'm doing here is there are of course hinges to this panel for it to hinge across when it's opening. Really easy. Just a few primitives. Positioning these. Make sure they look right. And I used AutoGrid to create these, but AutoGrid might be off by like a few decimals of a degree, so I always need to go back and double check if it's not doing something wrong. And this is just simple modeling to get the shape in there, using SwiftLoop to add the control edges. No big deal. That's the cylinder done. Now back to the boxes, which are ridiculously simple. This sort of stuff, if you're just chamfering a box, there's a plugin that does this. It's called Edge Checks. You can use that as well, but it costs money, so I'm not using it. Here we are. Attach it, and that part looks okay. There's still some detail missing, and the smoothing wasn't correct, so I need to add a few edges to control the smoothing. And I'm taking this same little detail and I'm going to use it somewhere else. Well, why? Because that shape seemed to look like it was the same shape. Scaling it around, moving it a bit. It's always easy if you can reuse detail, saves work. Now here's an interesting one. This one isn't just a simple box. It's a box with some triangle shapes that are attaching it to that main part. So I'm using a box as the base. And because it has an even subdivision, both ends are the same, and instead of using symmetry, I'm just going to use connect, which compared to using SwiftLoop, you can make sure that two ends are exactly the same. Whereas if you would repeat the action on the left side and then do it manually on the right side, things wouldn't look the same. While connect ensures that you can do this sort of thing. Now these parts are triangles, but I'm not going to create them as triangles. They're just quads. I'm hiding that in by moving the extra vertices inside the object they're attached to. And once that basic shape is down, it's only a matter of adding the control edges. I'm using connect a lot here because, well, it's repetition and I want to make sure it's a little bit uniform in look. So connect works better there. Just select 4 edges, hit ring, hit connect, and you've done it 4 times. Even more. So I guess you could say that you should use connect when you have to repeat an action more than once, but it's not worth taking all the steps for connect if you can do it with one click with SwiftLoop. So there are some of these nuts at the bottom, doing the same old random rotation trick. And at the front of this panel, there's supposed to be a handle that you can use to open it. and this handle needs to be attached to that panel, so I'm creating a simple box shape here, which I will then use to create the handle out of. Here we go. Move these around. It's actually rounded at the front, so I'm moving these vertices out and selecting these, bridging them, hitting connect to make sure the smoothing is correct, and then deleting the backside so things don't get messed up by that. So that's the part where the handle will attach. Now to create the actual handle, using a spline because, well, that's what it looks like. It's a rectangular shape that sort of gets wider at the bottom. I shouldn't draw this with a line because if you draw this with a line, it's hard to get the widening at the bottom uniform on the left and right side. Just use scale on that, it's easier. Then when scale is done, I'm simply selecting the vertices and using a fillet on them to get that rounded feel in there. Then adjusting the settings slightly. Around. And then attaching everything together. There's another detail at the top, very simple. It's just a sort of slope box, but I gotta add it since it's big enough to be quite visible. Taking that box, using an extrude to get the top on there, getting the basic shape down, and all that's left is adding the control edges. And I forgot to delete the bottom, and that's messing things up, so select one, hit grow, hit grow again, and delete. Why am I using grow? Well, I would have to select the tiny edges around the edge that take care of the smoothing. I would have to select them manually. If you use grow, it's just a simple trick of doing things faster. There are some cylindrical parts in here. I'm going to create those as well. Simply move these cylinders around in the correct position, and then start working on them as an editable poly. Now this part is pretty simple. I just need to add a nut on the top, and that will pretty much finish it up. That's a little bit too big, so I'm scaling it down, attaching it together, and then I'm just moving these out. Manually spacing them again, I'm just going to eyeball the distance. With that done, I can attach them. There you go, that part looks a lot more believable and more interesting with those details added. Now there's an extra detail at the bottom there, which is not much more than a simple box. So I'm just going to do the same thing there. Add a few of these segments in between to make sure that it's smoothed nicely and attach it together. Now, I can use one of the details from this box at the back as well. I'm just going to move it around to the right position. Actually, it sits somewhere in between. A little bit smaller though. Move it over there. And these, once again, they're attachment points for that armor that I talked about. These are rotated. And they're also slightly bigger. Yeah, those are, you can use them in two different ways actually. Shove them into the object and then stick them to the side of it. Two different types of details, which I think both look okay. Right, so that side is mostly done. I'm going to go back and focus on the back of this cabin over here. All of this that I've just selected is separate plating, so we're just going to detach that and work a little bit on that. Remove some edges that are necessary. Bridge over the top, because, well, that's actually closed and I don't want to put that in the roof. And then, interestingly, the plate continues to the top. It's higher than the rest of the plates. The roof will actually not extend over the back, so I'm creating it this way. Then I'm selecting all of these, shift moving them back to get some of that thickness in there, that armor plated look. Okay, so I'm selecting these and moving them slightly in. And it's important, I have to put some care into how the armor plates are exactly meeting. If they stick out too much, it's not going to look too believable, so I need to fix that up. extrude here. Can't forget to add the subdivisions so that I can weld them together. Weld these up, and then go back here and weld those up as well. Make sure the threshold is correct. Alright, so now I'm just going to use Swift Loop to once again add a few control loops in there. There's quite a few I have to add here, but if you work with this a little bit, it's not difficult to imagine where you would want to add each of them. Back there. Okay. Looks about good. I'm going to copy the Turbo Smooth. Well, first attach it to the other object. It's the same thing. You can copy Turbo Smooth or attach it to another object. So I want everything to be one single object again in the end. Well, most of it, not the separate details. I'm just going to attach instead of copy Turbo Smooth. So, time for that interesting part at the back with the crazy slopes. Using a few tricks here, like adding a loop to be able to add another one and then removing it again, etc. This one's pretty tricky also. Line this up. And then move these over there. I'm trying to get the slopes right. I need a few more edges for that. These will sit about over there. And there's actually another one over here, making things even more complex. I'm going to take these, snap them to the right position. This part seems sort of symmetrical, though it's not entirely. One part is actually a little bit wider than the other, so I'm creating them like that. These are actually moved inwards a little bit. I'm going to get this right. This is really difficult in terms of slopes. I'm taking my time for this, making sure that I'm doing things correctly. Easier to connect those three with a cut, so that's what I'm doing. And you can see that the bad smoothing groups in my low poly here are making it a little bit difficult to work with to see what I'm exactly doing. So might want to change that later on. Okay. Connect these. And add another line here to connect them. Move it down using edge constraints. That means those will be nicely hardened. And then just use Swift Loop to add a whole bunch of them. Manually spacing them apart a little bit because Swift Loop and Connect for the same matter has some trouble with these sloped surfaces. Doesn't really place the edge exactly like I want it, so sometimes I have to fix it, especially at the corners of these sloped areas. These are sitting together a little bit too closely, so I'm moving them out. It's about okay. And as you can see, I forgot a few, so time to get back and add those. Starting to look better. Still a few missing. Obviously, I need to add one there and there. There as well. And one at the top. And the corners on the outside as well. Okay, so I'm unhiding everything. Just to see how it fits together with the other parts. Also because I want to start thinking about adding some thickness to it. Selecting all of this. Using the edge extrude method again because it's a bit more of a complex object. And that might be almost all the edges. Might have forgotten one at the bottom there. See about that. All right, need to move these around a little bit. Messes up the smoothing slightly. As well, not everything is aligned in a single plane anymore. Doesn't matter so much, even though this is a little bit sloppy, but Turbo Smooth will fix these minor problems, which is why I'm leaving it like that. Alright, that's the extra edge I was talking about. Over there. Okay, so there are these little L-shaped parts that come out of the plates at the sides and the corners. Adding those. Just a simple few extrudes. And then there's this sort of funny armored plate that hangs down from the back. I think it's just a bit of a rough improvised way to armor the hydraulic systems that hide behind it. There are like a lot of hydraulic hoses for the Ripper at the back, which we'll be doing in one of the next videos. They're hiding behind that plate. And this plate just armors those and protects them from gunfire or explosions. It's a funny plate, just square shaped with a little extrusion at the top, and it's bolted onto the back. Okay. What I'm doing now is I'm taking this panel and I'm going to place it on quite a few places of the back of this cabin. And the way I'm doing that is I'm just drawing boxes on it using AutoGrid, and then repositioning the panels in the correct orientation. I also need to rescale them, move things around a little bit, but it's a faster way than creating each of them from scratch. Of course, I need to delete that box, can't use that anymore. And if I select these separate parts in a smart way, select the corners, move those around, etc., I can really get the shape in there pretty quickly. Move those up slightly. Move a little bit inwards. And of course, rotate the handle so it sits in a logical position for opening this hatch. Then I attach that part. And here's a little detail I want to make as well. These hatches, they have to close in some way. Right now, the way I made them right now, they could just flap open, fall open. They're not really secured or tightened or anything. So this is a hook that I'm making, and a little sort of lock mechanism will latch onto this hook and close things off. There we are. Hook looks about right. And the other part of the mechanism is a little box as a start with a few more details attached to it, as you'll see right away. And this thing has I think it might be fastened with sort of a little belt thing. The belt might hook onto that hook on the top. I don't really know how it exactly works, but we're just modeling this after the reference. Adding some edges. And then a rounded part here at the back, which was really simple to create. And then what I need is one of these details that I made before, one of these open parts with a hole in them to actually fit in the inside there. Slightly too big, so I need to rescale that. And this one seems to fit the bill nicely. And then finally, there's the part that will actually hook around. I think that little open rounded hole part that sticks out is a way to add a lock to this mechanism. You can just put one of those big hanging locks in there, and it closes off that part of the bulldozer. It's a bit low tech, but I like that. It looks chunky and simple. and then use some rounding over there as well. We need to decrease the number of the interpolation. That looks better. And then I can just attach all that stuff, and that's it. Same trick with the hatch on the other side. You've seen me do it before. It's just the same exercise. Move it over. Then do a few selections to change the global shape. This one's just slightly bigger, slightly higher. Not that much change. And the hinges are actually on the other side, so I'm just moving them around, rotating them, and repositioning them. They're also a bit larger, so I upscale them and then move them back into position. And I can just take this same lock part and use it for the other one. I mean, it took some work to make, so we just gotta save that work and reuse it. This part's slightly smaller, so that's what I'm doing, just moving it inwards. They actually have two of these, so yeah, just duplicate. Not much to it. That handle is in the center. And then it's time for a new little part, just for some variation. There are more of those panels, but I want to get to this. These are attachment plates for really big handles that sit at the back of the cabin, which I think are for climbing onto the top of the roof of the bulldozer. And they have this interesting hexagonal shape to them. But some of the sides of the hexagon are smaller than the others and some are bigger. And I quite like that. So there we are. I'm going to start with this one. Some of them are rounded also on the corners, so a little inset. And it's not an exact hexagon, it's more like a triangle with rounded corners, as you can tell. If I would make a hexagon, I'd do a better job. And these are the actual handles that will be attached to it. They're just rectangular shapes. Gotta delete the back though. That stick out of these plates. And these plates are attached to the handles, and there are two nuts that secure it to the main structure. Using fillet on the corners. Fillet is such a nice tool in these splines. You can see me use this all through the project. I'm taking the same one as a separate object, mirroring it, moving it into the correct position, then taking these nuts, positioning them, slightly rotating them, and an important detail is the other triangular part is an instance, so the bolts, if I attach them to one, are immediately also attached to the other one since it's an instance. So with that done, I attach those two instances to the big part over here, and I'm going to move it till it's almost in the right position. Then just create a few copies of them, move those into the right position, and that's that. Then back to one of these panels. After that little bit of distraction, this panel is also slightly rotated since it opens by flapping downwards. And moving these things around slightly. And this one's a little bit more interesting and different than the others. It actually has a slightly angled side to it, which is nothing difficult. I mean, it just means I gotta change the verts around a little bit more. I also want to make sure it matches the angle of the surface that it sits against. Well, it would just look sloppy if it didn't. There we go. Slightly change that around. As I said, I want to match that. Okay. Attaching that as well. And then I'm just going to copy this one to the other side, since they're actual duplicates on two sides. And this one's a bigger, a lot wider also, and has some interesting sort of, I don't know what these are. I think they're also nuts to fasten these hinges. They might be nuts to fasten them, but they might at the same time be attachments for the slat armor. Don't know. The other hinges don't have this, so it's a small detail, but I try to notice this sort of stuff and actually model it. Now, here's a part that I feel I also need to add to the bulldozer. It's not really a fun part to add. Why? There's very little reference on it. It's not really clear how it looks. What is this? It's a sort of plate system attachment bracket, whatever, for the radio antenna of a bulldozer to sit on. Of course, this bulldozer needs to communicate with command, and for that there needs to be communication equipment, which requires an antenna. And this little part is for the antenna to attach to. But once again, there's a little reference on it, so it's not really clear how exactly this needs to be modeled or what it looks like. Just trying to create what you see. It's not a focus point, so it doesn't matter if it's not entirely correct. Even on the most high-res pictures, this thing was really blurry. Okay, so that's the main bracket. Need to add a few more smoothing, correcting loops to that. Change the color. And there we are, a few primitives added to it to continue adding some detail. Okay. And with this cylinder, it's all just using bevel. You need to do a lot of operations on a cylinder, just use bevel. Why? Because it's an extrude and an inset all in one single tool. You can use it as extrude, you can use it as inset, or you can use both at the same time to actually bevel. So there we are. Adding more detail for the base of the antenna. And then adding a few loops. It's quicker to add these than to always switch settings on the bevel. This box here needs to be aligned nicely. Gotta use the correct buttons. Okay. Now, there's another box here also. I think a single box just doesn't look interesting enough, so I'm adding another one. Attaching that together, and extruding that box slightly. Get the shape a little bit more interesting. Move that around. And add a few more edges to correct things. Okay, these parts seem about okay, so I'm just going to attach them. There we are. Looks okay from that distance.